Commander Veltar stood on the bridge of his battlecruiser, watching the view screen with growing amusement. The humans had arrived at Coalition Station 3 just hours ago, and already they were causing problems. Not the dangerous kind of problems that required weapons or shields. The funny kind that made his crew chuckle behind their claws. The newest species in the galaxy looked exactly like the reports had said. They walked on two legs like most civilized races, but they seemed so fragile. No natural armor plating like the Zephyrians. No crystalline skin like the Shard Warriors. Just soft pink or brown skin covered by fabric and metal pieces they called clothing and armor. Captain Jake Morrison led the human group through the station corridors. He carried what the humans called a rifle on his back. Veltar had studied the weapon files with his tactical officer. It was a primitive device that threw small metal pieces using chemical explosions. The humans seemed proud of these weapons, even though most galactic species had stopped using projectiles thousands of years ago. Behind Morrison walked Lieutenant Amy Santos and Sergeant Ben Clark. Santos carried a device she kept looking at, holding it in front of her face and pressing buttons. Clark had more weapons than seemed reasonable for someone his size. Knives, more projectile weapons, and small explosive devices hung from his belt and vest. The Coalition had built this station to house representatives from dozens of species. The corridors were wide enough for the massive Titan warriors and had neural link ports for species that communicated through thought. But the humans seemed to need none of these advanced features. They talked to each other using mouth sounds, pointing at things with their fingers like children. Subcommander Kith approached Veltar at the command station. His four eyes were bright with humor. "Commander, the humans are having trouble with the food dispensers again." Veltar pulled up the security feed on his personal viewer. The three humans stood in front of a standard nutrient dispenser, the kind that read brain patterns and created perfect meals based on biological needs. Captain Morrison was pressing random buttons on the manual override panel. Lieutenant Santos was talking to the machine like it could hear her. Sergeant Clark had given up and was eating something from a small package he had brought with him. They refused to use the neural interface, Kith continued. They say they do not trust machines in their heads. This made Veltar laugh out loud. Every species in the galaxy used neural interfaces for everything. Communication, navigation, weapon targeting, even entertainment. The idea of living without a direct brain connection to technology seemed impossible. How did they coordinate in battle? How did they share tactical information instantly? The view screen switched to show the main briefing room. Admiral Thexara, a crystalline commander with over 200 years of combat experience, was explaining the threat they all faced. The Void Swarm had been moving through this sector of space for months, destroying everything in their path. These creatures could adapt to any weapon used against them, changing their biology to resist energy beams, plasma fire, and even nuclear weapons. The assembled military leaders listened through their neural links, downloading tactical data directly into their minds. Battle plans, weapon specifications, and enemy analysis flowed into their brains in seconds. But the humans sat at their table with actual paper, making marks with primitive writing tools. Morrison asked questions out loud, interrupting the data stream that other species received silently. "Admiral, what kind of terrain will we be fighting on?" Morrison's voice cut through the quiet room. The other commanders looked at each other with confusion. The terrain data was part of the standard information package that had been transmitted to everyone's neural implants. Why was this human asking for information he should already have? Admiral Thexara explained patiently that the planet Kepler 442b had rocky canyons, metal-rich mountains, and dense forests. The humans wrote this down on their paper like they could not remember it otherwise. "What about weather patterns?" Santos asked next. Again, this information was readily available through the neural network. Veltar began to wonder if the humans had damaged brains that could not process standard data feeds. Sergeant Clark raised his hand like a student in a classroom. "How many enemies are we expecting to face?" The questions continued for an hour. The humans asked about supply lines, communication protocols, and backup evacuation plans. All of this information existed in the tactical database that every other species accessed instantly. But the humans wanted to hear it spoken out loud and write it down on physical materials. When the briefing ended, the other commanders filed out quickly, their neural implants already processing new orders and updates. The humans stayed behind, looking at their papers and talking among themselves in quiet voices. Veltar decided to observe them more closely. He activated the station's internal sensors and followed their movements through the corridors. The humans did not go to the standard recreation areas where other species recharged their neural implants or synchronized their equipment. Instead, they found an empty cargo bay and began what they called training. Morrison and Santos practiced fighting with their hands and feet, moving in patterns that seemed designed to hurt other humans. Clark cleaned his weapons with careful attention, checking each part like his life depended on perfect maintenance. They did not use any electronic training systems or virtual reality combat simulators. They just moved their bodies and touched their equipment with their hands. "This is fascinating," Kith said, watching the feeds with Veltar. "They prepare for battle like ancient warriors." "No technology assistance at all," Veltar agreed. It was like watching a museum display come to life. These humans acted like species from the early days of galactic civilization, before neural implants and energy weapons had changed warfare forever. They seemed to trust only what they could see with their eyes and touch with their hands. The more he watched, the more Veltar felt a mixture of amusement and concern. These primitive warriors would be fighting alongside the most advanced military forces in the galaxy. Their simple weapons and ancient tactics would be tested against an enemy that had defeated dozens of modern civilizations. He sent a message to Coalition Command, recommending that the humans be kept in reserve positions during the coming battle. They would need protection from enemies their primitive weapons could not handle. It would be cruel to send them into real combat against the Void Swarm. As he prepared his report, Veltar felt confident that the humans would learn much from fighting alongside superior species. Perhaps they would finally understand the value of proper technology and modern warfare. If they survived, they might even upgrade their equipment to galactic standards. The thought made him smile. These humans were like children playing with ancient toys, about to learn what real war looked like. 3 days before the battle, Veltar decided to visit the human quarters personally. He had been watching them through security feeds, but seeing their preparations up close would give him better insight into their capabilities. As the ship's chief tactical officer, he needed to understand every unit under his command, even the primitive ones. The human section of Coalition Station 3 was smaller than areas assigned to other species. Humans apparently needed less space and fewer technological accommodations. When Veltar arrived, he found the corridor filled with strange sounds and smells. Through an open doorway, he saw Sergeant Luke Davis sitting on the floor with a rifle across his legs. The weapon was completely disassembled, its parts spread out on a cloth. Davis cleaned each piece with careful attention, using brushes and oils like an artist working on a sculpture. The chemical smell came from the cleaning solvents the humans used on their weapons. Veltar had never seen anything like it. Modern weapons were self-maintaining, with internal systems that kept them in perfect condition. Most galactic species simply replaced worn equipment with new items from automated factories, but this human was caring for his weapon like it was a living thing. "Why do you do that?" Veltar asked, stepping into the room. Davis looked up without surprise, as if alien commanders visited him every day. "Sir, a clean weapon is a working weapon. This rifle might save my life tomorrow, so I treat it right today." The explanation made little sense to Veltar. If the weapon broke during battle, why not just get a new one? The logistics computers could manufacture replacements in minutes, but Davis continued his careful cleaning, checking each part before reassembling the rifle with practiced movements. In the next room, Private Kate Miller was engaged in combat practice. But instead of using training simulators or neural-linked combat programs, she was fighting against the air. Her body moved in complex patterns, throwing punches and kicks at invisible enemies. Sweat covered her skin, and her breathing was heavy from physical effort. "What is she doing?" Veltar asked Davis. "Combat drills, sir. Kate's our close-quarters specialist. She practices every day to stay sharp." Veltar watched Miller's movements with growing confusion. Her techniques looked designed to fight other humans, not the massive creatures in the Void Swarm. How could punches and kicks affect enemies with armored carapaces and acid blood? It seemed like watching someone prepare to fight a starship with a wooden stick. The sounds from the corridor grew louder, and Veltar went to investigate. Captain Morrison had gathered his entire unit in the main hallway for what they called war games. 20 human soldiers were divided into 2 groups, practicing what they called tactics. Morrison's voice carried clearly as he shouted instructions. Blue team, you have the high ground advantage. Use it. Red team, find cover and move in pairs. Remember, communication is key when technology fails. The humans ran through the corridors using hand signals and whispered commands to coordinate their movements. They practiced scenarios where their radio communication stopped working, where their weapons ran out of ammunition, and where they had to fight in complete darkness. None of these situations should occur with modern military equipment, but the humans prepared for them anyway. Other alien species conducted their pre-battle preparations very differently. The Zephyrian shock troops synchronized their neural implants and updated their combat algorithms. The Shard warriors meditated to align their crystalline bodies with their energy weapons. The Titan warriors simply recharged their power armor and checked their plasma cannons. But the humans ran around the station corridors, sweating and shouting and practicing with their primitive equipment. They acted like their technology might fail at any moment, preparing backup plans for situations that modern armies never faced. Lieutenant Santos approached Morrison with a request that made Veltar's eyes widen in disbelief. "Captain, I'd like permission to scout the battlefield personally before we deploy." Morrison nodded as if this was a reasonable idea. "Denied, Amy. Coalition protocols don't allow advance reconnaissance by individual units. We'll have to work with the data they give us." Santos accepted the decision without argument, but Veltar could see her disappointment. She actually wanted to visit the dangerous planet ahead of time, to see the terrain with her own eyes instead of trusting the detailed maps and sensor data that Coalition intelligence had provided. This desire to personally verify information seemed to be a common human trait. During briefings, they asked for paper copies of digital data. In combat planning sessions, they drew diagrams by hand even when computer projections were available. They seemed to trust only information they could see, touch, and verify themselves. Veltar reported these observations to Coalition Command through his neural implant. His message was brief and efficient, transmitted directly from his thoughts to the command network. Within seconds, he received new orders placing the humans in reserve positions during the coming battle. The response from Fleet Admiral Zekthor was equally direct, appearing in Veltar's mind without words or sounds. The humans would be held back from the main assault, used only if the primary forces needed additional support. Their primitive weapons and basic tactics made them unsuitable for frontline combat against an adaptive enemy. That evening, Veltar attended a dinner gathering for the various military leaders. The humans sat at their own table, eating food they had brought from their homeworld instead of using the station's advanced nutrient systems. They talked loudly among themselves, discussing battle plans and sharing stories from previous conflicts. Other species communicated through neural networks, sharing experiences and strategies through direct mind-to-mind contact. Entire conversations happened in seconds, with complex tactical discussions transmitted as pure thought. But the humans used their mouths to make sounds, requiring minutes to exchange information that advanced species could share instantly. Commander Thaxel of the Shard Warriors approached Veltar's table. His crystalline body glowed with soft blue light as he spoke through the neural network. "The humans seem undisciplined. Will they be effective in combat?" Veltar considered the question carefully. The humans certainly lacked the advanced coordination and technological integration of other galactic species. Their weapons were crude, their communication methods were slow, and their tactics seemed designed for fighting other primitive armies rather than evolved alien threats. "They will learn from watching superior forces in action," Veltar replied through the network. "Perhaps this battle will show them the value of modern warfare." Around the dining area, other commanders shared similar thoughts. The humans were brave enough, but their methods belonged to an earlier age. They would need protection during the real fighting, and they would need education in proper military techniques afterward. As the evening ended, Veltar felt confident about the coming battle. The Coalition forces were well prepared with advanced weapons and coordinated strategies. The Void Swarm would face the most sophisticated military technology in the galaxy, supported by centuries of tactical evolution and scientific progress. The humans would watch from safe positions and learn what real warfare looked like when conducted by truly advanced civilizations. The attack on Kepler 442b began exactly as Coalition intelligence had predicted. The Void Swarm descended from the outer system like a living storm, their bioships pulsing with dark energy as they entered the planet's atmosphere. From his command position aboard the orbital battle station, Veltar watched the enemy approach through long-range sensors. Admiral Thexara's voice filled the neural network, coordinating the defense through direct thought transmission. Battle plans flowed into every commander's mind simultaneously. The Zephyrian shock troops would establish the primary defensive line. Shard warriors would provide energy weapon support. Titan warriors would serve as heavy assault units. The humans would remain in reserve, 30 kilometers behind the main battle zone. Veltar felt satisfaction as he watched the deployment begin. Coalition forces moved with perfect coordination, their neural implants allowing instant communication and flawless tactical synchronization. Thousands of soldiers took their positions without confusion or delay, each unit knowing exactly where to go and what to do. The first contact came at dawn. Void swarm creatures emerged from their bioships like a plague of living nightmares. Each creature was different, their biology constantly shifting and adapting. Some looked like massive insects with cutting claws. Others resembled flowing liquid that could reshape itself at will. All of them moved with deadly purpose toward the Coalition defensive positions. Energy weapons lit up the battlefield as Coalition forces opened fire. Plasma beams, particle cannons, and focused laser arrays created a brilliant light show against the planet's rocky terrain. The initial assault was devastating. Hundreds of void creatures fell to the advanced weaponry, their bodies dissolving under the intense energy bombardment. Veltar monitored the battle through his tactical display, feeling confident about the outcome. The enemy was fierce but primitive, using only biological weapons against the most advanced military technology in the galaxy. The Coalition's energy shields absorbed most of the creatures' attacks, while their weapons cut through enemy ranks with surgical precision. But something was wrong. After the first hour of fighting, the Coalition's weapons began losing effectiveness. The void creatures were changing, their bodies developing new defenses against the energy attacks. Plasma beams that had killed dozens of enemies now barely scratched their hardened carapaces. Laser arrays that had cut through creature ranks like knives now reflected harmlessly off their adapted skin. The neural network buzzed with concern as field commanders reported the problem. Admiral Thexara tried to compensate by ordering weapon frequency changes and power increases. But the creatures adapted faster than the Coalition could modify their attacks. Within minutes, energy weapons that had been completely effective became almost useless. Commander Zethek of the Titan Warriors sent an urgent message through the network. His heavy assault unit was surrounded in Canyon 7, their plasma cannons unable to penetrate the creature's new defenses. The massive warriors were being overwhelmed by enemies they could no longer effectively fight. Veltar's own unit faced similar problems. His Zephyrian shock troops had advanced to secure Hill 394, but now they were trapped there as adapted creatures swarmed around their position. Their energy weapons fired constantly but caused minimal damage. The creature's biology had evolved beyond what Coalition technology could handle. All units fall back to secondary positions, Admiral Thexara ordered through the neural network. Reconfigure weapons for maximum power output. But the retreat was difficult. Void creatures pursued the Coalition forces, their adapted biology making them nearly immune to defensive fire. Veltar watched his tactical display with growing alarm, as blue dots representing friendly units began disappearing from the map. His communication system crackled with an unexpected sound. A human voice speaking through primitive radio waves instead of the neural network. Coalition forces, this is Captain Morrison. Human units are moving to assist. Veltar felt a mixture of relief and concern. The humans had been ordered to stay in reserve, but with Coalition forces in retreat, any assistance might help. Still, what could primitive projectile weapons do against enemies that had adapted to advanced energy technology? Captain Morrison, this is Commander Veltar. My unit is surrounded on Hill 394. The enemy has adapted to our energy weapons. Morrison's response came immediately, his voice calm despite the chaos of battle. Copy that, Commander. We've been watching the tactical situation. Human units are moving through Canyon System, Charlie, to reach your position. Veltar checked his maps. Canyon System. Charlie was marked in red on all Coalition charts, labeled as impassable terrain. The narrow passages and unstable rock formations made vehicle movement impossible, and the complex layout would confuse navigation systems. No reasonable military force would attempt to move through such dangerous ground, but apparently the humans were not reasonable. Veltar's sensors showed small contacts moving through the canyon system, traveling on foot through terrain that Coalition computers had deemed logistically impossible. The human soldiers were carrying their equipment manually, navigating by sight through passages too narrow for vehicles or proper communication arrays. 20 minutes later, Morrison's voice came through the radio again. "Commander Veltar, we have visual contact with your position. We count approximately 200 void creatures surrounding your hill. Request permission to engage." Through his optical sensors, Veltar could see the creatures that had his unit trapped. They were huge armored beasts with massive claws and acid-dripping mandibles. Their carapaces had adapted to deflect energy weapons, making them nearly invulnerable to Coalition technology. How did the humans expect to fight such monsters with their primitive equipment? "Permission granted, Captain," Veltar replied. "But be advised our energy weapons are ineffective against these adapted creatures." Morrison's response was puzzling. "Copy that, Commander. Energy weapons won't be a problem for us." Veltar activated his visual displays to watch the human attack. Through the smoke and chaos of battle, he could see small figures moving through the rocks below his position. The humans advanced in pairs using hand signals and whispered commands to coordinate their movements. They carried their projectile weapons ready, but they seemed impossibly small compared to the massive creatures they were about to face. The first human opened fire from a concealed position among the rocks. The sound was different from energy weapons, a sharp crack followed by a metallic impact. One of the massive void creatures stumbled, dark fluid spraying from a hole in its armored carapace. More humans began firing from different positions. Their weapons made the same sharp sounds, sending metal projectiles at incredible speeds into the creatures' bodies. The adapted armor that had deflected energy beams was no protection against solid projectiles. Moving at hypersonic velocities, Veltar watched in amazement as the humans systematically destroyed enemies that had been immune to advanced weapons. The creatures tried to adapt, thickening their armor and changing their body chemistry, but they could not evolve protection against simple physics. Metal moving fast enough would penetrate any biological defense. Within 30 minutes, the area around Hill 394 was clear of enemy forces. The humans had eliminated every creature using weapons that the Coalition had considered obsolete thousands of years ago. Sergeant Luke Davis appeared at the edge of Veltar's defensive position, like a ghost materializing from the rocks. His uniform was covered in dust and his face was streaked with sweat, but his eyes were sharp and focused. Behind him, more human soldiers emerged from concealment points that Veltar had not even known existed. "Commander, we've secured the immediate area," Davis reported, "but we've got bigger problems coming your way." Veltar studied the human soldier with new interest. Davis had just led his unit through terrain that Coalition computers had marked as impossible to traverse. They had carried heavy equipment over rocky ground without vehicles or mechanized support. Most impressive of all, they had done it without using any electronic navigation aids that the void creatures might detect or jam. "How did you navigate through the canyon system?" Veltar asked. Davis pointed to a piece of paper in his hand. It was covered with hand-drawn marks and symbols that meant nothing to Veltar's advanced tactical systems. "Old-fashioned map and compass, sir. Sometimes the simple ways work better than complicated technology." The radio crackled with Captain Morrison's voice. "All units be advised. Long-range sensors show a major enemy concentration moving toward Hill 394. Estimated 3,000 creatures. Adapted variants ETA 20 minutes. 3,000 adapted void creatures would overwhelm any Coalition force, even one with working energy weapons." Veltar felt his confidence crumble as he imagined the approaching swarm. His neural implants automatically calculated defensive possibilities and found them all inadequate. But the humans were reacting differently. Instead of fear or despair, Veltar saw excitement in their eyes. Davis was already talking into his primitive radio, coordinating with other human units using verbal commands instead of thought transmission. "Captain, this is Davis. We'll need artillery support on Grid 77. Santos, can you get your people into flanking positions on the North Ridge? Miller, I need demolition charges set up in the canyon mouth." Veltar listened to the human communications with fascination. They were planning a complex defensive operation, using only voice commands and visual signals. No neural networks, no computer coordination, no technological assistance. Just humans talking to other humans and making plans based on what they could see with their own eyes. Lieutenant Amy Santos arrived with her squad 15 minutes before the enemy attack began. She had positioned her soldiers in locations that Veltar's computers had not even identified as viable firing positions. The humans had found rocky outcrops and natural trenches that provided perfect fields of fire, while remaining hidden from enemy sensors. "How did you identify those positions?" Veltar asked Santos. She looked at him with surprise, as if the answer was obvious. "We walked around and looked at the ground, sir. Sometimes you see things with your eyes that computers miss." The Void Swarm attack began with a roar that shook the ground. Thousands of creatures poured through the valley approaches, their adapted biology making them resistant to every energy weapon the Coalition possessed. They moved like a living flood, overwhelming everything in their path through sheer numbers and evolved defenses. Coalition forces fired their energy weapons with desperate intensity, but the beams barely slowed the advancing creatures. The monsters had adapted beyond what advanced technology could handle, their biology evolving in real time to counter every energy-based attack. Then the humans opened fire. The sound was unlike anything Veltar had heard in modern warfare. Instead of the clean hum of energy weapons, the battlefield filled with sharp cracks and metallic impacts. Human projectile weapons fired solid metal at speeds that created sonic booms. The adapted creatures had no defense against simple physics applied with overwhelming force. Private Kate Miller demonstrated why the humans called her a close-quarters specialist. When a massive creature broke through the defensive line, she met it with a combination of explosive devices and blade weapons that the monster had never encountered. The creature tried to adapt its biology to her attacks, but it could not evolve protection against a knife moving fast enough or an explosion happening inside its body. Miller moved like a deadly dancer, using techniques that seemed designed to fight other humans but worked perfectly against alien biology. She targeted weak points that energy weapons could not reach, exploited physical vulnerabilities that no computer had identified, and fought with an intensity that shocked even Veltar's experienced warriors. But what truly amazed Veltar was the human coordination. Without neural implants or computer assistance, they maintained perfect tactical communication using hand signals, radio calls, and visual cues. When their electronic equipment failed under enemy interference, they switched to voice commands and simple gestures without missing a step. Captain Morrison appeared in the center of the defensive position, calmly directing the battle while enemy creatures died around him. He carried a rifle like his soldiers, but he spent more time talking into his radio and pointing at terrain features than actually shooting. His commands were simple and direct, spoken in language that any human could understand instantly. "Davis, shift your fire to the left flank. Santos, bring your people down 50 meters and hit them from the side. Miller, we need those charges detonated now." Each command was followed immediately without question or delay. The humans moved with fluid coordination, despite using the most primitive communication methods in the galaxy. They adapted their tactics constantly as the battle developed, making changes faster than any computer system could process. Sergeant Ben Clark proved that human artillery tactics were as effective as their small unit operations. Using paper maps and visual observation, he directed fire from human weapons positions with devastating accuracy. His calculations were done by hand, using mathematics that any coalition computer could perform in microseconds. But the results were perfect, placing explosive rounds exactly where they would cause maximum damage to enemy formations. "How are you calculating those firing solutions so quickly?" Veltar asked Clark during a brief pause in the fighting. Clark held up a small device covered with moving parts and numbered dials. "Slide rule, sir? It's like a mechanical computer that never breaks down or gets jammed by enemy interference." The battle continued for 3 hours, with waves of void creatures breaking against human defensive positions like water against stone. Every time the monsters adapted to one human tactic, the soldiers simply switched to a different approach. They had dozens of weapon systems, hundreds of tactical variations, and unlimited ability to improvise new solutions to combat problems. When energy weapons failed, humans used projectiles. When projectiles became less effective, they used explosives. When explosives were insufficient, they used blade weapons and hand-to-hand combat. They had backup plans for their backup plans, alternative methods that required no technology beyond human intelligence and physical capability. As the sun set over the battlefield, The last void creatures retreated into the darkness. The ground was littered with alien corpses, testimony to the effectiveness of weapons that galactic civilization had abandoned millennia ago. The humans had achieved total victory using methods that advanced species considered primitive and obsolete. Veltar stood among the human soldiers as they cleaned their weapons and tended to their wounded. They worked with the same careful attention they had shown during peacetime preparations, maintaining their equipment by hand and caring for each other without technological assistance. For the first time in his military career, Veltar wondered if advanced technology might actually be a weakness rather than a strength. The final phase of the battle began at dawn when Captain Morrison implemented what he called combined arms tactics. Veltar watched through his tactical display as the humans coordinated different types of weapons and soldiers in ways that no other galactic species had ever attempted. Artillery units led by Sergeant Clark provided covering fire while infantry squads advanced through terrain that energy-resistant creatures could not defend effectively. When the monsters tried to adapt to projectile weapons, human demolition experts used explosives that worked differently than bullets. When creatures evolved protection against explosives, close combat specialists like Private Miller attacked with blade weapons that required no chemical reactions or electronic systems. The void creatures could adapt to any single type of attack, but they could not evolve defenses against multiple different threats happening simultaneously. Their biology simply could not change fast enough to counter the variety of human weapons and tactics, but the most devastating human advantage was something Veltar had not expected. While other coalition species fought as individual units with similar capabilities, the humans used what Morrison called combined operations. Infantry worked with artillery, engineers supported assault troops, medical teams operated in coordination with combat units. Every human soldier had multiple specialties and could perform different roles as the battle situation changed. When void creatures jammed the neural networks that other coalition forces depended on for coordination, the humans continued fighting without any technological assistance. They used hand signals, voice commands, and simple visual cues to maintain perfect tactical communication. Their coordination actually improved when electronic systems failed, because they had trained to operate without technological support. Lieutenant Santos led a flanking maneuver that would have been impossible for species that relied on neural link coordination. Her squad moved through rocky terrain using only whispered commands and finger-pointing to stay organized. They maintained communication silence that prevented enemy detection while coordinating complex movements that surprised the creatures completely. The Void Swarm had never faced an enemy that could function effectively without electronic systems. Every other galactic species became confused and disorganized when their technology failed. But humans seemed to fight better when forced to rely on their natural abilities instead of artificial assistance. Veltar received reports from across the battlefield that told the same story. Wherever human units engaged void creatures, the results were decisive victories. The monsters could not adapt to fighting methods that required no technology to counter. Simple physics, basic chemistry, and human intelligence were proving more effective than the most advanced weapons in galactic civilization. As the morning progressed, the tide of battle turned completely. Void creatures that had seemed unstoppable when facing energy weapons began retreating from human positions. The monster's adaptive biology had reached its limits when confronted with the sheer variety of human warfare methods. By noon, the battlefield was quiet except for the sounds of humans calling to each other and checking on their wounded. Veltar walked through the area where the fiercest fighting had occurred, stepping carefully around the bodies of creatures that had been killed by weapons most galactic species considered antiques. He found Captain Morrison sitting on a rocky outcrop, calmly reloading his rifle, while Lieutenant Santos treated wounded soldiers using basic medical supplies. The human medical techniques looked primitive compared to advanced healing technology, but they were working effectively in field conditions where sophisticated equipment would have been useless. Captain Morrison, Veltar said, approaching the human commander with something he had never felt before when addressing a primitive species. Respect. Morrison looked up from his weapon maintenance. His uniform was dirty and torn, his face was covered with dust and sweat, but his eyes were clear and alert. Commander Veltar, how are your people holding up? The simple question surprised Veltar. Morrison was asking about the welfare of alien soldiers, showing concern for beings from a species that had treated humans as inferior primitives just days ago. "My unit survived because of your assistance," Veltar admitted. "I owe you an apology, Captain. We underestimated human capabilities." Morrison finished loading his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. "No apology needed, Commander. We're all on the same side here." But Veltar felt compelled to understand what he had witnessed. "How do you coordinate so effectively without neural implants? How do you maintain communication when electronic systems fail?" Santos answered while continuing to bandage a wounded Zephyrian soldier. "We train for equipment failure, sir. Technology is useful, but it's not reliable in combat. We learn to fight with our brains and our hands, not just our machines." This philosophy was completely opposite to everything galactic civilization had developed over thousands of years. Advanced species had spent millennia perfecting technological solutions to combat problems. They had created weapons that required no physical skill to operate, communication systems that eliminated the need for spoken language, and tactical computers that made human decision-making unnecessary. But the humans had rejected this path. They had kept their primitive weapons and basic tactics specifically because these methods worked when advanced technology failed. What other species saw as backwardness, humans saw as reliability and flexibility. Sergeant Davis joined the conversation while cleaning his rifle with the same careful attention Veltar had observed before the battle. "Commander, can I ask you something? Why do your people trust machines more than yourselves?" The question struck Veltar like a physical blow. Zephyrian culture, like most galactic civilizations, had evolved beyond individual capability. They used neural implants because organic brains were considered inadequate for modern warfare. They relied on energy weapons because projectile weapons seemed crude and inefficient. They followed computer-generated tactics because artificial intelligence was supposedly superior to biological decision-making. But humans had proven that biological intelligence, primitive weapons, and individual capability could defeat the most advanced military technology in the galaxy. They had won through adaptability, creativity, and the ability to function when their tools failed them. "We believed that technological advancement meant abandoning primitive methods," Veltar said slowly. "We thought evolution meant becoming more dependent on our machines." Morrison stood up and looked across the battlefield where human soldiers were helping wounded aliens and sharing their supplies with coalition forces. "Maybe evolution means learning to use technology without becoming helpless when it breaks." In the days that followed, Veltar found himself studying human military methods with the intensity of a student learning from a master. He watched their training exercises, studied their equipment maintenance procedures, and tried to understand their tactical philosophy. What he discovered changed his understanding of warfare completely. Humans did not reject technology because they were primitive. They maintained simple methods because these approaches worked reliably under any conditions. Their weapons required no power sources that could fail. Their communication systems needed no networks that could be jammed. Their tactics depended on human intelligence that could adapt to any situation. Most importantly, humans had retained the ability to fight effectively when everything else failed. They were not helpless without their technology because they had never allowed technology to replace their natural capabilities. Veltar submitted a formal request to Coalition Command asking for human military advisors to train other galactic species in what humans called basic combat skills. The response came back immediately through the neural network, carrying approval from the highest levels of military command. Within weeks, human instructors were teaching advanced alien warriors how to clean weapons by hand, navigate without electronic assistance, and communicate using voice commands and visual signals. The galaxy's most sophisticated military forces were learning primitive techniques from the species they had considered backward and obsolete. As Veltar participated in these training sessions, learning to use paper maps and mechanical instruments, he realized that humans had taught the galaxy an important lesson. True strength came not from having the most advanced technology, but from maintaining the ability to succeed when that technology was not available. The species that other civilizations had laughed at as primitive warriors had proven to be the most dangerous military force in galactic history.